Something massive is happening in Europe, but the mainstream media won't tell you the full story. While they push distractions and downplay reality, a political earthquake is reshaping the continent. The far right is no longer a fringe movement. It's winning elections, taking over governments, and rewriting European politics. In Germany, AfD just hit 20.8% of the national vote, their strongest result since World War II. In France, Marine Le Pen's National Rally crushed Macron in the 2024 EU elections, forcing him to dissolve parliament. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' PVV won the most seats, shocking the establishment. Europe is shifting because people are fed up with open borders, economic decline, and failed leadership. Politicians ignored them. Now they're fighting back. In this video, we'll break down the real reasons behind this movement, national identity crisis, how globalization erased cultural roots, mass immigration and crime, the crisis no one wants to name, economic collapse, why the working class was abandoned, broken trust in the establishment, how elites betrayed their people, media suppression, the truth they're desperate to hide. The media won't cover this, but we will. Across Europe, people are asking a crucial question. What does it mean to be German, French, or Swedish today? For centuries, national identity was built on shared culture, language, and history. But in recent decades, rapid globalization, mass migration, and political policies that downplay national heritage have led to an identity crisis. This isn't just about immigration or economics. It's about a disappearing cultural anchor. People fear not just change, but the speed of change, and the fact that they were never asked if they wanted it. For years, the EU and globalist policies pushed a collective European identity while weakening national sovereignty. Countries that once controlled their own laws and borders now answer to Brussels, reinforcing the belief that citizens no longer have a say in their own future. In Germany and France, national pride has been systematically discouraged due to historical guilt. Germans have been taught that patriotism is dangerous, while France's colonial past has been used to justify dismantling traditional identity in favor of multiculturalism. The result? A generation unsure what they're even supposed to stand for. Meanwhile, demographic shifts are happening at a pace that communities can't adjust to. Many native Europeans no longer feel at home in their own neighborhoods, where culture, language, and traditions have changed overnight. Christmas markets and national celebrations are altered or cancelled to avoid offense, leaving many wondering why their own traditions are being sacrificed. Losing national identity doesn't just impact culture, it creates deep social and political fractures, social fragmentation. When identity weakens, societies break into competing groups with no shared values, political polarization. Without a unifying culture, people turn on each other, pushing politics to the extremes. The rise of nationalism. As identity dissolves, people turn to leaders who promise to restore what was lost. This is why parties like AfD, National Rally, and the Sweden Democrats are surging. They reject national guilt and promise to defend culture, history, and traditions. Their message is clear. We are not ashamed of who we are. We will defend our culture. We will put our people first. For millions, this isn't a message of hate. It's a demand for leaders who respect and preserve their nations instead of dismantling them in the name of progress. The real question, can Europe reclaim its identity before it's too late? Or is it heading towards self-erasure? For years, European leaders have avoided the uncomfortable conversation about the link between mass immigration and rising crime. The topic is politically explosive, and those who bring it up are often dismissed as fear-mongering or xenophobic. But the reality on the ground tells a different story, one of increasing violence, strained social services, and communities that feel abandoned by their governments. In the name of tolerance and humanitarianism, European leaders opened their borders to millions of migrants from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, promising that they would integrate seamlessly. What they failed to account for was the sheer scale of the migration, the cultural differences, and the inability of many nations to effectively integrate so many newcomers in such a short time. The result has been a growing sense of unease, a noticeable rise in crime, and a public that is increasingly frustrated with the government's refusal to acknowledge the problem. For decades, Europe prided itself on being one of the safest places in the world. But over the past 10 years, crime statistics have painted a different picture. Violent crime, including murders, rapes, and assaults, has risen sharply in countries that took in the largest number of migrants. Gang activity has surged, with many new groups linked to migrant communities. Entire neighborhoods have become crime hotspots, where law enforcement struggles to maintain control. The issue is not just that crime has increased, it's that it has increased in very specific ways, in very specific places, and disproportionately involves young male migrants. Right, let's talk about Germany. Back in 2015, they welcomed over 1 million migrants, and since then, there's been a noticeable change in crime. The government promised everyone that these new arrivals would settle in just fine, but official reports from the German Federal Criminal Police, their equivalent of the Met Police, paint a different picture. These reports show that non-Germans are involved in a much higher proportion of violent crimes. We're talking about things like knife attacks, sexual assaults, and gang violence. And these are becoming more common, especially in big cities like Berlin, Frankfurt, and Hamburg. A real turning point, a moment everyone remembers, was New Year's Eve in Cologne, also in 2015. Hundreds of women were sexually assaulted by gangs of migrants. A truly shocking event that at first the authorities tried to brush under the carpet. Sadly, things haven't improved since then. In fact, they've gotten worse. Organized migrant gangs have turned safe neighborhoods into no-go zones, places people are afraid to visit, and this has led to ordinary Germans demanding that something be done. This public anger has helped a political party called Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD. They're now more popular than the ruling Social Democrats in some parts of the country. The message is clear: Germans want to feel safe, and they expect their government to make that happen. Sweden, once one of the safest and most progressive countries in Europe, has undergone a dramatic transformation. Gun violence has more than doubled in the past decade, making Sweden the only European country where shootings have increased rather than declined. Bombings and grenade attacks, previously unheard of in Swedish cities, are now common as rival migrant gangs battle for control. Police have identified over 60 areas as vulnerable zones, places where law enforcement struggles to operate effectively. The once proud model of Swedish integration has collapsed under the weight of reality. Even politicians who once championed open-door policies are admitting their failure. In 2024, Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson publicly stated that Sweden's immigration policies had been a mistake and that the country was no longer safe. This shift in rhetoric came too late for many Swedes, who had already shifted their political support to the Sweden Democrats, a party once dismissed as radical, but now a dominant force in national politics. France has also experienced the repercussions of years of uncontrolled immigration. The country has long grappled with social unrest in its suburbs, which have large immigrant populations. But recently, this unrest has intensified into full-blown riots and violent confrontations with the police. The nationwide riots of 2023, sparked by the police shooting of a 17-year-old boy of North African descent, left French cities ablaze for weeks. Areas like Seine-Saint-Denis, a suburb of Paris, have become practically no-go zones, rife with drug dealing, gang violence, and extremism. High-profile murders, including the beheading of teacher Samuel Paty by an Islamist migrant, have heightened fears that radicalization within migrant communities is a serious problem, a problem the government seems reluctant to address. President Macron has attempted to minimize the link between mass immigration and the rise in crime, but the French public aren't buying it. The 2024 European elections saw Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party become the leading political force in France, a clear indication that public tolerance for the government's policies is wearing thin. Europe's working class is being crushed, and the political elite doesn't seem to care. As economies shrink, industries collapse, and wages stagnate, the very people who built these nations are left struggling to survive. While governments and corporations push their climate agendas, mass migration policies, and globalist economic models, working-class Europeans are watching their jobs disappear, their bills skyrocket, and their futures dim. For generations, the backbone of the European economy was stable, well-paying jobs in manufacturing, industry, and local businesses. Today, those jobs are disappearing. Factories are closing, small businesses are struggling, and traditional industries are being dismantled in the name of climate policies and globalization. Germany, once Europe's economic powerhouse, is now facing an industrial collapse. The country's decision to cut ties with Russian energy after the Ukraine war backfired spectacularly, leading to record-high electricity costs and mass layoffs in manufacturing. Thousands of jobs have disappeared as companies either shut down or relocate to countries with cheaper energy costs. The once proud German auto industry, long a symbol of European success, is shedding jobs at an alarming rate, as government policies push for an accelerated transition to electric vehicles without considering the impact on workers. France's blue-collar workers are also feeling the squeeze. The country's industrial output has declined steadily, while automation and outsourcing have eliminated thousands of jobs in traditional sectors. Even Italy, which has long relied on a mix of industrial production and tourism, is seeing small businesses collapse under the weight of high taxes, inflation, and suffocating EU regulations. And what is replacing these lost jobs? The gig economy. Instead of stable employment with benefits and long-term security, more and more people are forced into low-wage, unstable jobs with no protections. Delivery drivers, warehouse workers, and temporary laborers now make up a growing percentage of the workforce, struggling to make ends meet as their purchasing power erodes year after year. While the cost of living explodes, wages have barely budged. Inflation is eating away at the earnings of the working class, making it harder to afford rent, food, energy bills, and even basic healthcare. In Spain, the average worker has seen their real wages decline by over 10% in the past 5 years, while rent and food prices have soared. In the UK, a nation that once prided itself on a strong middle class, more than half of working households now report struggling to cover basic expenses. Even in Scandinavia, once the gold standard for social democracy, the gap between the rich and the working class is growing rapidly. Governments keep telling people that inflation is temporary, but the reality is clear. The cost of everything is going up, except for wages. The middle class is shrinking, and the gap between the wealthy elite and the struggling working class has never been wider. Meanwhile, corporate profits are soaring. Multinational companies have posted record earnings, while small businesses, often the heart of working-class communities, are being squeezed out of existence by taxes, regulations, and unfair competition from global corporations. One of the biggest betrayals of the working class has come in the form of Europe's aggressive climate policies. While framed as necessary for the environment, these policies have devastated industries that once provided millions of jobs. The Netherlands is a prime example. The Dutch government's decision to force farmers to cut nitrogen emissions led to mass protests and widespread anger, as thousands of family farms faced closure. These farmers, who have fed Europe for generations, were told to either comply or lose their livelihoods. Similar policies across Europe are making agriculture and food production more expensive, leading to higher food prices for the very people who can least afford it. Germany's energy transition disaster has also been a massive blow to workers. The government's push for a fast shutdown of coal and nuclear energy has led to rolling blackouts, higher electricity costs, and an exodus of energy-intensive industries. Steelworkers, auto manufacturers, and chemical plant workers are all seeing their jobs disappear, while their governments tell them to learn to code or switch to green energy jobs that don't exist yet. This isn't about whether climate action is necessary, it's about how it's being done. The reality is that the burden is falling entirely on the working class, while the elite class is untouched. The effects of this economic destruction go beyond just wages and jobs. It's tearing apart the social fabric of European nations. Working-class communities, once strong and self-sufficient, are now filled with hopelessness, addiction, and crime. Rising economic despair is fueling record-high mental health issues, alcoholism, and drug abuse. Entire neighborhoods in major cities have been hollowed out, as jobs leave and families struggle to survive. In places like northern France, former East Germany, and rural Spain, young people are leaving in droves, searching for opportunities elsewhere. This is creating a lost generation of workers who feel they have no future in their home countries. Many of them are turning to far-right or nationalist parties, not because of ideology, but because they are the only ones talking about these issues. Meanwhile, Europe's political class continues to gaslight the population, telling them that things aren't that bad or that they should simply work harder. They live in their gated neighborhoods, send their kids to private schools, and never experience the reality of the policies they impose. For decades, European citizens placed their trust in governments, institutions, and mainstream political parties, believing that these entities existed to protect their interests and ensure stability. That trust is now in free fall. Across the continent, people are increasingly rejecting traditional politics, turning away from legacy parties and shifting towards nationalist, populist, and anti-establishment movements. Why? Because after years of broken promises, blatant hypocrisy, and policies that serve elites rather than ordinary people, Europeans are realizing that the political class is out of touch, out of control, and unwilling to listen to the people they claim to represent. This collapse of trust in the establishment is not just a political trend. It is a profound crisis of legitimacy that threatens to upend the entire European order. The European establishment, politicians, mainstream media, EU bureaucrats, has spent years making promises it could not keep. It told people that globalization would make them richer, that mass immigration would make society stronger, and that climate policies would create new economic opportunities. Instead, the exact opposite has happened. European leaders promised that open borders and multiculturalism would enrich society, yet many European cities have become fractured, crime-ridden, and socially unstable. They assured citizens that green policies would bring a prosperous future, yet those same policies have killed industries, raised energy prices, and driven businesses out of Europe. They preached democracy, ignored massive protests, and silenced dissent when people objected to policies that hurt them. Now, people are waking up to the fact that the establishment does not serve them, it serves itself. The European Union, once seen as a stabilizing force, has become one of the biggest symbols of elite detachment. Brussels makes sweeping policies that affect millions of people, yet most Europeans have little say in how these decisions are made. The EU imposes economic policies that crush national industries, climate mandates that destroy jobs, and immigration quotas that change societies without public consent. When countries push back, the EU punishes them. Poland and Hungary, for example, have faced financial penalties and legal threats for refusing to accept the EU's migrant quotas. Italy has been threatened for challenging Brussels' economic policies. The EU is supposed to be about unity and cooperation, yet it increasingly behaves like an imperial bureaucracy that punishes nations for protecting their own citizens. More and more Europeans are asking, is the EU really working for us, or just for the political elites? The rise of nationalist, populist, and anti-establishment movements across Europe is undeniable. From Germany's AfD to France's National Rally, from Italy's Giorgia Meloni to the Netherlands' Geert Wilders, millions of Europeans are rejecting the mainstream political order in favor of leaders who put their own citizens first. But instead of reporting on why these movements are growing, the mainstream media has waged an all-out war to suppress, distort, and discredit them. The media, once seen as a watchdog for democracy, has become the enforcer of the political establishment, using censorship, smear campaigns, and outright misinformation to keep people in line. The strategy is simple: label, discredit, and silence. And the more people wake up to this, the more desperate the media becomes. Whenever a nationalist party gains support, mainstream outlets immediately go on the attack. The goal is not to inform, it's to manipulate public perception by framing these movements as a threat. When AfD surged in Germany, headlines warned of the return of fascism, even though the party's main platform is about securing borders, restoring economic sovereignty, and reducing crime. When Marine Le Pen's National Rally dominated in France, the media compared her to Hitler, ignoring the fact that her supporters include millions of ordinary French citizens fed up with crime and economic decline. When Italy's Giorgia Meloni won, outlets described her as the most dangerous woman in Europe, all because she opposed mass migration and defended Italy's sovereignty. Rather than acknowledging the real reasons behind their popularity, failed immigration policies, economic hardship, and a growing disconnect between elites and citizens, the media defaults to fear tactics, painting these movements as radical and extreme. This deliberate distortion isn't just bad journalism, it's propaganda. One of the most common tactics the media uses is wordplay. Instead of engaging with the arguments of nationalist parties, they use loaded terms to make them seem dangerous. Anyone who questions open borders, far-right extremist. Anyone who criticizes crime statistics, spreading hate speech. Anyone who challenges climate mandates that hurt workers, conspiracy theorist. Anyone who calls out corruption in the EU, dangerous populist. By controlling language, the media is forcing a narrative where ordinary citizens who simply want safer streets, stable economies, and national sovereignty are portrayed as extremists. And it's not just words. Governments are actively using these labels to silence dissent. In countries like Germany and France, protesting against mass immigration has resulted in arrests, with people accused of spreading hate speech for voicing concerns. The EU has even pushed for legislation targeting disinformation, which conveniently applies to anyone questioning mainstream narratives. The message is clear: if you don't agree with the establishment, you are dangerous. When smearing these movements isn't enough, the media and governments turn to outright censorship. In 2023 and 2024, social media platforms across Europe ramped up content moderation, specifically targeting pages and influencers who supported nationalist movements. Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, now X, deplatformed accounts that shared crime statistics, exposed government failures, or supported anti-EU politicians. Independent media outlets have been demonetized, blacklisted, or banned altogether under the pretext of stopping misinformation. The result? The only voices left standing are the ones approved by the establishment, outlets that repeat government narratives without question. The EU has taken this even further with its Digital Services Act, which forces tech companies to remove harmful content. But who decides what's harmful? The same political elites who are being challenged by the rise of nationalist movements. This is not democracy. This is an information war designed to keep citizens ignorant, controlled, and afraid. Another powerful media tactic is what they choose not to report. If a migrant commits a violent crime, most mainstream outlets bury the story or avoid mentioning the attacker's background. But if a nationalist politician makes a controversial statement, it's headline news for weeks. This kind of selective outrage is designed to manipulate emotions rather than inform people of reality. It creates a false image of the world, where crime is random, protests against the government are dangerous, and anyone supporting nationalist policies is a threat to democracy. The media routinely ignores the stories that could hurt the establishment. The growing number of violent attacks in European cities is dismissed as isolated incidents. The economic struggles of the working class are downplayed to focus on climate change. Corruption scandals in the EU are quietly brushed aside. But voters aren't blind. They see what's happening in their own communities, and they know when the media is lying to them. The media's attempt to silence nationalist movements is backfiring spectacularly. The more they try to control information, the more people turn to independent sources. In France, alternative media platforms like CN News have exploded in popularity, giving airtime to voices the mainstream ignores. In Germany, citizen journalists are using Telegram and local networks to expose crime stories that newspapers refuse to cover. Across Europe, nationalist parties are bypassing traditional media entirely, using social media, podcasts, and direct outreach to spread their message. The numbers don't lie. Trust in mainstream media is collapsing. Polls show that fewer than 40% of Europeans trust what they see on major news networks. Instead of controlling the narrative, the media's suppression tactics are pushing people toward alternative voices. This is why the establishment is panicking. They cannot stop the growing wave of nationalism, so they are resorting to desperate measures. More censorship, more propaganda, more fear-mongering. But it isn't working. The harder they try to silence this movement, the stronger it becomes. Because no matter how much they try to suppress it, this movement isn't going away. The people have had enough, and no amount of media spin can stop what's coming. Europe is reaching a breaking point. The question is no longer whether people trust their leaders, they don't. The question is whether the establishment will change, or whether it will be completely replaced. For now, It seems like they have no intention of listening. That means the movement away from establishment politics will only accelerate. The future of Europe will not be decided by the politicians in Brussels, Berlin, or Paris. It will be decided by the millions of people who are tired of being ignored. The collapse of trust in the establishment isn't just a political crisis. It's the beginning of a new